There is a primal scream rising on this planet, and as many would argue, from this planet. Think of it as a boiling point of pain and disconnection, a culmination of disappointment, if you will, that we are unwilling, or even more concerning, that we are incapable of closing the gap between knowing better and doing better. In my work with young people, I hear a common refrain: I'm not suicidal, but I'm not sure I want to be here anymore. This is a clarion call that something's got to give. The New York Times refers to this slow death of the human condition as a pandemic of loneliness. Mental health practitioners refer to it as a crisis of global proportions, leading to ever-increasing rates of suicide, self-harm, addictions of all sorts, violence against others, and a population increasingly dependent on mood-stabilizing drugs just to function. Bottom line, we are struggling to exist in a world our nervous systems were not designed for. To exist in a perpetual state of fight or flight is the greatest theft of our human experience. We're being robbed of our potential to live a life of peace and harmony. Is there a way out of this path of self-annihilation and mutual destruction? I believe there is. My hypothesis is that if we are willing to go to school on our wounding, to remove shame and blame from our past, to find grace in all that has come before, and with even greater courage apply a lens of love to the present moment, our future can be radically and beautifully different from our past. Our failure to learn from our past forever binds us to the suffering of our ancestors. Our inability to meet this pain with compassion and wisdom is a key point of frustration for many. That frustration is the catalyst for this podcast. The Primal Scream podcast is an ongoing conversation with ordinary folks who have met their primal scream head-on and turned it into a powerful catalyst for change in their lives. They've stepped away from the performative expectations placed on them by their family and/or society, despite encountering resistance from within and external constraints along the way, leaving behind both the trauma of their story and the trauma drama that often ensues. Change is hard, but as these beautiful humans share their stories, we learn the intimacy of change is the opening to a life well lived. If you are feeling the existential dread of being alive on the planet at this time, you are not alone. If you're exhausted by the simple act of just being here, you are not alone. As you listen to these storytellers reveal their raw and real journeys to wholeness, it is our hope that you will find courage to do the same. Is there one message to take away from each of these podcasts? I believe there is, and it is simply this: you are not crazy, and you are not alone. Hi, Michelle. Welcome to the Primal Scream podcast. Thank you so much for your willingness to show up both in your life and in this moment of vulnerability and sharing. I'd like to start this session with just a little bit of a story. One night, and boy, I'm coming out of the closet in a big way through this podcast. I'm going to talk about a lot of my psychedelic experiences. I was in ceremony with grandmother, ayahuasca, for those that aren't familiar with that terminology, and I was struggling with this piece of myself, like letting all of myself be fully seen. And the message was, you need a sacred witness circle around you. And I was like, well, what does that look like? And then the download continues, and it was these people, and you get together for a year and you encourage everybody to just show up fully as themselves. And that this is something that you never got as a child. You never were witnessed at the level of your essence by your parents. And until we have that experience, we don't really begin to trust our essence. And so it was a year later, and I had done all the things very prescriptively, invited the people. We got together 4 different times. We shared medicine space together, and everybody, I said, tell me the parts of yourself that you are most nervous about showing to the world.
And we did. Over the year, we shared, we Marco Polo back and forth, and people were like, and this thing happens, and things begin to, the molecules begin to heat up around us, and life begins to open up more and more the more we own our truth and our essence. And at the end of that year, I was back in ceremony with grandmother, and I was like, thank you so much for that wisdom about having a sacred witness circle around me. It's the least we can do for each other. And it was one of those moments, and I know you probably have had them, where the universe kind of slaps you upside the head and says, wait a minute, it's not the least of the things we can do for each other. It is the greatest gift we can give each other, is to be a sacred witness to each other. And so by you being here with me today, you are both witness and witnessed by me in sharing this arc of truth. The Primal Scream podcast came as an invitation for myself and to bring others into it, to begin to talk about the ineffable, to talk about that part of our journey that is so deeply interior that, it's okay if it stays in there. We don't always have to share all those private conversations we have with ourselves. But at some point, and this is the point of this podcast, I want to be able to say to people, you're not crazy and you're not alone. Because I think there are a lot of people that are stepping into their path and feeling a little dysregulated and disoriented as they're walking away from life of expectations and projection from the outside world to follow a different wisdom keeper, one that's internal rather than external. So Michelle Holmes, welcome and thank you for being with us today and opening yourself up in such a beautiful way. And so I have a whole series of questions, but I'm sure we'll get into the conversation in the right way without trusting that the questions are here for nothing more than just sort of a framework. But your origin story is important, I think. And so could you start there? Who are you? What should we know about you? What was the beginning point of your journey? And then at the end, we'll come to, and how did you get where you are today?
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And just because I really am curious to be clear with your guidance, where would you like me to drop in? Because I know you are creating a very intentional space. So really want to honor that and understand if this is origin story, who am I? Like,
I want to both guide, but also get out of the way of, like, some people I've asked this question of, and they started, well, I knew from about age 3 that I was going to be a seeker, and it took me blah, 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 blah. Somebody else had came in and said, I followed a path of my parents' choosing until boom, something happened, and then they broke out of the mold. So maybe where you were when you felt like you needed to step out of the mold.
Yeah, thank you. I think I was born out of the mold. The issue for me was being born somehow believing that I was entitled to the rights of everyone around me. And it sounds ridiculous to say when I hear it, like, how does a child, and yet maybe that's how most children are. And I, for some reason, what I didn't allow myself to do was to ever sort of give in to the idea that I wasn't, it wasn't so much for me about worthiness, but it was like about that I was here too. and that my agency somehow, so I spent a lot of years bumping my agency up against all the structures of the world that aren't meant for agency in children. School, like, rules, just, it's not really functional, when a child doesn't want to honor those things. Eventually I found places where it was necessary for me.
But almost from the start, you had this sense that there was something for you beyond the construct that you were sitting in. Is that fair?
No, no, I wouldn't. I'd say that was
Okay.
way too conceptual. It was just my freedom to choose my will. It was not really a spiritual connection. It was will. It was like pure primal
Love it.
human will that was unbowed. And so it was an interesting experience of just knocking my head against the door over and over and over in many, many ways.
It's interesting that you were aware that you had
This
a
was
will.
not
Um, do you know, can you have a sense of when you recognized that it was your will that was bumping up against? Because as a child, I think we
yeah, no, as a child,
right.
I couldn't have articulated that for sure. So it was a holding of many of the things that I was reading by the time I was in the 7-year-old was very intense Holocaust, ancient and modern slavery, suffering of economic, so somehow I had found my way into this resistance mentality out of all the great writings that come to children, and some of it that wasn't intended for children that I found. But the really subversive, radical messages about freedom did get to me as a little girl in the early 70s in Indiana, where I grew up. So for some reason, I was just holding this fight for what I perceived and my limited experience was freedom. So by the time, maybe it has to do with, like I was born in 68, by, the bicentennial became this huge thing, which so much focus around America, freedom, and simultaneously starting to understand the horrors of the human condition, art history. So it's a great question. What did I experience and when? I think I had an internal connection with myself that was very strong. At a certain point in my mid-teens, it went haywire. I can remember sitting under a desk in my room, like in a breakdown, saying to myself, like, literally, I was born in the wrong century. I should not be living here. I do not belong here. And a few months later, I was in a psychiatric hospital where I spent a couple of different residential times. I found a lot of power there, I have to say. It was almost like, whew, I get out of all this conformity. That it was kind of like a frog. You're steeped in the soup of conformity. I don't think I went around saying I'm in this conformity, but I remember the relief of like, wow, who are these people? And getting to sit all day.
How old are you now? 15?
16
and something
17,
about your
probably,
orientation to the world has created a moment for you to be in a psychiatric setting, and you're surrounded with people who have also found themselves in a psychiatric setting because the world is not working for them, and you found that freeing. Say more.
And I found the people so beautiful. Like I can remember writing a poem. I started writing poetry sketches in there to capture these beautiful. I mean, it's like you're living inside a movie, because you have this not shrunken, but condensed, this essence of people outside of the sort of ways we must fit ourselves to be in. And that's not even judgment. It's just what is necessary to maintain a place in the mainstream. And, I can remember people who were like, I realized, like, I cannot get through to you. Like, I can't find you here. Others, I thought, wow, you're literally on vacation like me. Like, you're here because this is the best place to watch TV all day.
Right.
Honor to you, and other people coming in really deep, deep suffering. And I, at that point, even though someone may have looked at me that way, I looked at these people in suffering. Even as I suffered, I carried this also witness of suffering. And so I really want to honor you in this call in this sacred witness process. And I have been in circle myself with just wisdom keepers of this witnessing tradition. And I really honor this. It's beautiful. And it's also beautiful when it happens, later in life when we can. I'm a grandmother of 6 children. So when we can come into this witness space, in safety, in a place where we have done so much of our essential work.
Wow, I did not know that. That's a beautiful pin in the map of you. If we're tracking the arc of truth, what is Michelle's truth? At a very impressionable age, you already had a deep sense of justice. You had the capacity to witness suffering. You were able to be in that space where some could have judged you as broken, could have judged you as a problem. And yet that's not what you took away from that. It's like you were an old soul from the start, and so how did that experience inform what came next for you? Because it must have been so narrative shaping. What came next?
Yeah, thank you. So I would have described myself surely as a feminist by the mid-'80s. When I was in high school, I can remember drawing a little poster during the time that ERA, the attempt to pass the ERA, and a little like women's rights now. It's just like a little kid stick drawing, but that's what mine said. And I come from a union background, on my grandmother, on my mother's side, organized a sewing factory. And so, I carry that. My dad, a teacher union, with deep ties to that work of organizing together as a practice for humans. So let's see, that was an off-track way to say, and yet part of me was also deeply questioning the systems, deeply questioning our structure, our political and social realm. And so what I decided was like, I really want, I would say to myself in high school, to just be a mother, which was at that time, I don't know. I won't even make a judgment on, everybody's at a different place on whether that is sort of your expected choice. It would not have been my expected choice. I was primed to, be a successful professional and expected to be, I would say. So I ended up going off to college, and the same eating disorder or mental disorders, whatever it was, mental non-disorders that had me hospitalized, it kind of came back. I wasn't quite ready to. Went to a small private liberal arts college, lasted about 3 weeks, and I decided, put on my backpack, I'm heading to the big city to make my living. And I just showed up on the train, on the bus in Chicago with, of course, no skills, no ability, tracked immediately in the bus station by some guy who was already trying to lure me into goodness knows what. He and another guy came the same night, looking for me. I was just the most little baby, vulnerable, know nothing, and eventually ran out of money after 2 weeks or less, 1 week. And ended up at the home of the man that I would later marry. So I'm 17. By the time I was 18, I got married. And by the time I was 25, I had three beautiful, amazing daughters. And that was a beautiful, conscious experience that for me, because I didn't yet know what I wanted to study, why like put off what
Right.
I already knew I wanted? So I
Mm.
became a mother very early, and it was very beautiful, conscious attempt at my conscious, like I see myself and honor myself, like, making choices like I'm going to have my older two children in the room when I birth at home the third. And so like this beautiful mental ability, but I still hadn't really done any kind of trauma healing at all. And so just looking back, I'm like, oh, that wasn't exactly the conscious birth. That was me shrieking in agony while my two little children watch, so some of that, some of the sort of semi-consciousness it's a little bit comical to look
I'm
back
laughing a little because
on,
I
for
had
me,
four
because I
children by
see,
the time I was 30,
yeah.
and I had them all at home, and I had the older ones watching the younger ones being born. And just
Oh,
like
did
you, I
you?
look back on that and think, wow, was that really the right choice? It is on some levels, and on others it probably wasn't. But at the same time, there was sort of a thread of consciousness in those early years, even though I wasn't fully aware
Good.
of my potential for more consciousness, like, but I kept following these breadcrumbs to my soul, these little things that felt like a yes along the way. Can you relate to that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. 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 So,
So now you've got three
um,
beautiful kids.
yeah, I know that, now I'm like so interested in all your journey and your birth journeys. And so at the same time, for me, what began to happen, like I was somehow found myself professionally in this guild of storytellers. So I was kind of like, now I would say like, wow, was I channeling? Uh, I don't know. I still don't use really any kind of language for things. I'm rooted very much as a skeptic, and I'll talk about that in a bit when I talk about my career, which I soon then moved into a career. So I was planning on this family, mothering as a choice. The big recession came along, that my children's father was out of a job, and so I needed to find work. So I went into my local newspaper and was the person who, like, back in the day, if you got a wet paper, it's raining and the paper
Right.
boy throws the wet paper and you're really angry and you're like, damn it, there's this new newspaper. Well, I was the person taking that call. So that was like my job. And then I would radio to Woody, the guy in the big brown truck, and he'd take
Right.
them a new paper. And so it was just that kind of customer service, people wanting to quit, people wanting to start the newspaper. The newspaper still, so this would have been 95, still, pretty big at the center of
Right.
American public life. And I managed to talk myself out of there and into the newsroom, probably primarily because my grandfather was in the Lions Club with the editor. So, I see this sort of like I have this self-made story, and yet he
There's
knew
always a
who I
context
was.
to that self-made
So it's,
story, right? Yeah.
yeah, and I think to me that's something I want to add in, because sometimes it's a reminder of the
Yeah.
layers of circle that we are being ourselves inside. Okay, so at that point, I'm having an amazing time. I'm starting to write editorials and like writing all these like radical thought. I mean, like just stuff that normal small newspapers in the
Mm.
Midwest do not write about, kids' rights, just really out there stuff. Somehow somebody gave me a pen and just never stopped me. And so I was training myself. At the time, I was mid-20s running editorial board meetings with U.S. senators. And I can remember saying, oh, this is like performance art. Today I'm
Mm.
playing the person
Right.
interviewing the senator. So at that point, I consider myself still very open. But the story I'm going to tell you is about sort of my climb into, in some ways, I thought I was fighting the man, and yet I was becoming the man. And that was really the move, my career progression that began. And I began growing, carrying bigger and bigger responsibilities, becoming the editor-in-chief of newspapers. And so then you have, even though I thought I was a disruptor, Edie, I was still carrying on these essentially white supremacist, cultural monoliths that news organizations were in a community. We now decry the demise of the American newspaper for democracy's sake. And yes, and they also are part of the crumbling of this place where a group of people, and I used to be one of those people, would say, this is what you should believe, the voice of the editorial board. And that was sort of this different way to
both things can be true,
at,
right? Like we were part of the system and also still pushing the edges of the system. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
so I don't know where I was going there.
So
Edie.
you alluded to, you teased up this moment where I heard the sense of a primal scream coming forward, a piece of where you just couldn't be part of that anymore. Does that help you land?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So I think there were a couple of those places for me. One coming into the editorship of a very beleaguered newspaper on the south side of Chicago. And it was really the time in which the job of a newspaper editor was to lay off reporters. That was just across the country what the mission was. And we were housed in a dark former department store that had the electricity turned off to the escalator. You can just imagine the sort of cave-like, beings down there, disgruntled, and me attempting to rise into leadership in a time where my very presence signaled, grievous harm, essentially, and fear to people. So my primal scream at that point somehow was, and I'll get into much more specific primal screams later, but this was one that it was like a propulsion. Suddenly I found myself on the short list at all three of the great sort of American journalism fellowships. And I know that I know that came out of this place of like me needing, like channeling everything out. And so I ended up at Stanford for a year. And here I am with no bachelor's degree, having the run of Stanford University as a fellow. And just a real moment there of recognizing my place in the world, like that this was possible, and this belonging and freedom that I felt, A, in California, coming from the Midwest, and B, at Stanford, at a place where ideas were everywhere. That's what people did, was talk about ideas. And to me, it was like a child in the most amazing Disneyland, and ended up in some performance arts studies and doing things that ended up in a session of a course with Condoleezza Rice, just things that really allowed me to start to see the world in a lot of ways that would then shape my next move, which was, I thought at that point after Stanford, there was such an opening for me, and I felt I would never go back into the world of news because it was a downward. Everyone was negative and unhappy. Part of that is just the nature of journalists, who for many years kind of carried that skeptic
by design. Yeah.
approach.
Yeah.
Reason by design, but it also infects a personality and a mood. It creates people that are always looking for the worst thing to find, including me, because that is the training, is to keep digging and keep looking and keep seeing. So for me, I believe that was behind me, and I was like singing the Silicon Valley song of endless possibility, which is what it feels like, to me, steeped in, what it felt like to me. This was 10 years ago, 13 years ago, steeped in this culture.
Yeah.
I'm very different now. So then I was recruited. I worked for a short time for a startup in business development with a live video company. And, making international deals with other news organizations, because this was now the future. This was the future, the live video. And it brought us so many wonderful things, Arab Spring and other things that we saw beginning to open up.
A globalization of information
the American
and
news
beliefs
model.
and geographical and political boundaries were starting to fall away. Yeah. Exciting time. Yeah.
Exactly. So exciting. And then I got a call from a news owner, a publisher of newspapers in Alabama. And at first I thought, well, there's no way. There's no way. Like, why would I move to Alabama? And our mentor, beautiful mentor, Jim Bettinger, who was running the Stanford program, said, well, that is the birthplace, essentially, of the American Civil Rights Movement. Like, where else would you tell stories? And that was an incredible propulsion. Like, of course, what was I thinking? And I rushed in just so full of joy to leading that without any recognition, Edie, of like why the complexities of this not being my story to tell.
Separation between you and the story. And I can imagine.
Layers on layers for me. So I could talk for 7 hours and not really tell. So I'm just going to give a real summary. Like, at that point, I was really coming in with lots of belief about the future. I was essentially carrying that kind of Silicon Valley-esque brightness of the possibility, and was able to bring that to kind of create some new structures in that news ecosystem in ways that produced some very, very beautiful, allowed others to produce very beautiful work. So my stretching and opening really just allowed other people's own heart work that was ready to flourish.
Nice.
Have a space. And so that was a big, big gift to get to do there.
To empower their voices. Bringing all of your background into that.
I would say make space. So now I'm talking about journalists who also felt a call to other ways of connection, other ways of, it was a lot of experimentation from So in the arc of my story, I would just say that was at the point where I was so in sort of I think I began to lose my own thread. You know what? But that's unfair to say, because other major work of awakening, work of connection was moving through that space. So it was just a lot of complexity. I guess it was the best way I could describe it is trying to hold my own human journey and do it while leading a statewide news organization.
Yeah.
in the heart of the Deep South, while working with other humans, all on various stages of their own opening, their own conscious journey, and against the backdrop of politics, against the backdrop. So I wouldn't say it became too much, but it became, the more I began to see all of these facets, the more I began to understand that my drive to supporting freedom through a free news media, which I had come to hold as part of my work. How do we now bring in more people through the digital era? You know, just how do we make this more free? How do we open this story more fully? You know, for me, it's the okay, so now I have to shift. There's no way to tell this story of where I was other than going really into the jungles of Costa Rica, into Lake Atitlan in Guatemala, and this worldwide journey I began having of exploring the depth of awakening to truth, you know, just the natural process that was happening inside of me as a human being. And so simultaneously to holding this news organization and battling in Senate races, you know, battling these big forces that were brewing on a very public scale, I was literally primal screaming in jungles. And so those things to me seemed as separate as the two boxes that we're in. You know, this is what Michelle did here, and this is what Michelle did
Can
here.
I hold just a comment? So there's, I love the arc of your story, because for so many of us, there comes a point of compartmentalization. There's what we do out in the world, but there's an inner journey happening that at some point the two don't reconcile each other. For me, that's where I found my scream, is like, I can't be two things. I must find a way forward where my work matches my internal passion, my inner wisdom comes forth in the work that I'm doing. That compartmentalization felt like a death to me. Does that resonate? Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you for that. Yeah. Thank you. So yes, being separate is really the trauma experience of when we come out of full belonging and integration into this separation. So, you know, it is essentially the shame story that kept me, you know, having this great shift of the heart, mind, body, spirit, and yet finding that it's so hard because, you know, if I was expressing this through my great awakening as a Christian, and then I would say, shouldn't that infuse everything that I do? And I suppose it should. I suppose there are ways to infuse our journey into the public life without requiring that others agree. So yet it can feel, to me, I kept it this very secret, not just private, not telling the gang I'm going off for an ayahuasca journey. You know, this just being a very, very private for me, out of really respect for both of the beings that I was showing up as, and really honoring both of those, but not having a place that they could safely meet. Even though people probably could see all over what I was doing and who I was. And yet I needed, for my safety, that wall, not allowing my inner self to be seen. And so it
I
was
was just
really,
for
go
me
ahead.
there was this
Yeah.
sense of I love hearing your journey because I think this is a common thread. And maybe that's the whole point of this podcast, these conversations, is to help other people see that there is a point at which your interior is growing and evolving, and your sensitivity and your awareness and your witnessing, and you're holding this part of yourself to the interior, to very boundary protected, because we don't necessarily trust yet that we can let it all show, let it all be seen, let it all be magnified out in the world for fear of rejection, judgment, abandonment, all the, and all the codependencies in our life come full force in our face. And yet, and I'm wondering if this is the next part of your story, as it was with mine, there just comes a point where there's no turning back, that I call it crossing the Rubicon of self-love, that there's no turning back on that part of yourself that you've come to know in a newly intimate way, that there is no going back. Can you relate to that?
Yeah. Sure. And mine just came wildly born into the world as my first grandchild. So, that was a very, my arrival at this place of grandmotherness really came very practically for me. And so I knew that this work of the heart that I had privately been living needed to be available, in the full. I needed it to be available. Like, that felt like my biggest calling was to be available. And so I left Alabama and then came back to Indiana, and I'm now living near where I'm born, near where my second daughter and her 4 children, and then my eldest daughter and her twin babies are living. So, and then my third daughter is in Hawaii at the moment. So, so now I'm in this very specific way in which there is no impediment. There is nothing between me and whatever I choose to bring as service into the world. So what a place, what a gift to get to be in, really where I find myself now.
This notion of a primal scream being a universal invitation for each of us to reach that point of awareness, and it takes a while to bring the mask down and to trust and allow and be present with all of the awkwardness of showing up as yourself. Like we didn't do it as children, we didn't do it as teenagers, we didn't do it as young women, but as elder women, as grandmothers, crones. And I really want to honor the grandmother piece of your story, because there is something about that, looking at our grandchildren and realizing this is my moment to show up and fully express who I am and my love and my heart's mission to bring more love into the world. You just, there's no more separation possible. You just can't live out of integrity with self anymore. And that primal scream is that invitation to come into full integrated self. Does that fit with your?
Yeah, I think it's almost, I want to clarify that sort of like the drive is almost very mammalian, that this is a calling, not because anyone else needs this. It's just, something that feels to me like the like just following
Right.
the homing instincts,
So the language I
following
use for this is there's a
the,
beckoning in our becoming that somebody asked me the other day, what is the word that you use to describe this human experience? And I said, becoming, that we're always becoming and that there's a beckoning in that becoming. And um, I also feel and have had the experience in my life that there's a reckoning in that beckoning, that there is a period of work that we have to put ourselves through to, we call it dark night of the soul. We call it integration. We have lots of language, but ultimately it's cleaning house of all the things. Go ahead.
you
Yeah.
know, and I'm so glad you used that word because it's now a word of the time, and a large piece of the later stage work that happened while I was in Indiana was the creation of a kind of a brand within the news organization called Reckon. And it was really to begin to grapple with these big questions. Now, they weren't existential questions as we're speaking, but in some ways they are. Everything is in Alabama because we have to confront, so much of our entire country's sort of, it's almost like Alabama is the shame center in of the nation
Right.
as a being. And so it is all of ours. It's easy to look and say
No,
it's
it's all of
theirs
ours.
down there. But it's all of ours, and really honoring those people who are in that place and doing their work in that place. But that word that came from, within that news organization of Reckon, and hearing you share that, I do believe that that's something that we begin to do. It is that it's almost like that boat, that Rubicon cross that happens of when, where do I, in all of this, how do I find the place that really feels, it feels like there is no resistance. When we can find the place that's not pulling us, it also gives us this place where we have an opportunity to grow in presence, because we have ourselves soft. We have ourselves without a mental pull that we need to be somewhere
I'm wondering,
else.
given your background with media, politics, the whole, as you said, Alabama is the shame point. I would even say it's where our shadow of slavery, our shadow of othering, of other, how we treat others in this world comes to a head. And what we're experiencing now in today's political landscape, that I really do feel like we're birthing a new story and it's beckoning us forward, and that we have to go through, and you'll relate to this having done a home birth. There's a laboring process that we're going through, a reckoning and the beckoning, and that reconciliation of our past and our present and our future into a choice point, an agency, and giving your, kind of going back to your childhood, recognizing your will, your agency as a mechanism of ownership for you. I mean, I've just thrown a lot of words: reckoning and agency and ownership and birthing and a new story. And I feel like so many of us are in this primordial soup of reimagining how and who we want to be in this human construct. Jump in.
So when I see and feel this primordial soup that you're talking about, so as we're in this soup and we're adrift in this soup, we have the opportunity to find sort of paddles that support our navigation. And so to me, in Alabama, it was this incredible legacy of freedom. You know, the sounds of the civil rights movement really informed so much of my youth. And it was the very physical experience of freedom, of the beckoning of freedom, of the call of freedom, of the freedom, of the liberation, of the self-liberation that continues in Alabama. It's like, so there is also this, whew, I mean, power. And so to me, this soup that is so primordial, when we feel agency, when we recognize like there are various paddles that we can pick up, that we can feel, that we can really become, move inside that energy, that freedom that's shooting out of the primordial soup, of the love that's there in the primordial soup. And that may be that may be anything. I don't know.
I think it's something, and that's, I think, one of the when I did the first episode of this podcast, I said what may make this one unique is we're going in with questions and not answers. I'm just so aware, because of all the conversations I've had with people over the last 10 years, that there is, we call it the Great Awakening, and that has all the woo and bullshit story you want to attach to that, or it's an indicator. It's a leading indicator of a deeper awareness that the old story does not work for us, that it has not worked for a lot of people for a long time, that it is our collective journey to reconcile ourselves with our past, but not with shame and blame, but with love and compassion, that we were on a learning curve. Many people have felt the weight of that curve on the back of their necks. And if we stay in that place of blame and shame, we never move to the place of true reconciliation and communion with each other. I feel this edge of misappropriation. Who am I? I'm a white woman. I don't belong in this conversation. But I do. We all do. In whatever frame we can show up open and learning and co-creating. Like, no one person or group of people can solve the big X. X is love. We're all here to solve for X in our own unique way, and find our song to sing in this lifetime. And so it's my hypothesis that the Primal Scream, I've talked about this at length in other forums, but I'll just bring it in here. When I have had those true Primal Scream experiences, it's been on 5-MeO-DMT. I've done it with ketamine. I've done it in just breath work exercise, where that rage of the feminine, the rage of the little girl, where my innocence was taken by a molesting entity, that there is within us, all of us, a rage. And I think it's good. Because it means that we're human, and we have awareness that not all that glitters is gold, that this world as it is not serving us. And we have this invitation to ask better questions. And so I guess I'm going to ask you, what would your better question be of this moment, in this place that we're in this almost unbelievable separation of people and ideological supremacies and threat to the innocence of, just watching what's happening in Palestine and other parts of the world, and yet it's a slow burn right under our noses in Alabama, in the South, in the West, in the North, in the East. It's all here. Sometimes we see acute phases of disconnection, and other times it's just a slow burn. Like, how do we move to the next? How do we move to the new story through your lens of perception? Because I think anybody who's walked that dark night of the soul knows that the work is worth the effort. The juice is worth the squeeze. It's hard sometimes, but to get to the other side of that, always recognizing that we're never done. But there is, I'm sure there must be a place where you can look back and say, I'm not that person I once was. Parts of me are still there, parts of me are here, but I have a new lens. Maybe speak to that.
Yeah, to me, I would say it's how can I be with myself in the middle of this world on fire? How can I be here with me in honor and respect and value, and also recognition of the many, many, many things I did not know? So to me, the question that I ask, the question is how can I show up in service to love?
I've shared the 90-10 rule, this idea that it only takes 10% of our imagination to get us 90% of the way home, but it takes another 90% of our imagination to get us all home. Like, how do we all cross that bridge from fear to love? And what you just said is so perfect. It's, you show up in service to love. You've made the juxtaposition, the move from me to we, and you're in service to the we. And it's my hypothesis, and maybe after many conversations we'll prove it together, that primal scream is an invitation to listen and follow those breadcrumbs and trust everything that brings your interior to the exterior, everything that brings your wisdom to the expression of your life is the right step. And to keep trusting that, to really, truly trust that you're here to express all of you. Right. I had this sense after my pulmonary embolism that I did not want to live an unlived life. I wanted to go all in on me. I did not know what that would look like. I did not know how that was going to manifest, but I knew that I was not there yet. I wonder how you sit with that all-inness for you. What does that look like for you?
I think that all-inness stems to me from, as a grandmother, I have a very different perception suddenly of life, because I see perfection. I see this being is literally perfect and is radiating, the universe. It has come as a pure being of universal creation. This is literally inside, and now it is outside, and it is in my hands. This child, this being is in my hands, and I see the perfection. Like, it is undeniable. And I was a mother. It was always, there was a filter. Is the baby okay? Am I a good enough mother? What's going to go wrong in the future? As a grandmother, we're in the grandmother-ness. Not that I can't ever slip out of that and get into fear or get into worry, but in that beingness, to just say, this is a perfect expression. This is a perfect expression. And so that means I was born a perfect expression, and you were born a perfect expression, and everybody on the planet, we are all these perfect expressions. And so all covered with the cloaks of not good enough, covered with another cloak of abuse, covered with another cloak of, cultural, of racial or gender discrimination, of religious, ethnic discrimination, another cloak from you weren't good at art, and another cloak you weren't good at music or science. All of the wealth and income inequality is just covering this light of beingness, of pure perfection. And so it's, to me, why sometimes it's hard to not I'm holding this feeling and this hope that stems from that place,
Yeah.
that this is us, even as I see us all walking in these, heavy, heavy garments of despair. So for me, my current work that I've developed since in the years since I've left my work is really designed. While the first part of my career, I focused on the health of humanity through the body politic and through the idea of freedom and the individual's lens in the free civic,
Right.
state to our democracy, our civilizations cannot be free while we are all we are at this point of overwhelming trauma. Now, the trauma was there in many ways, the deeply suppressed trauma all through, these eras that we think were peaceful,
Right.
the Cold War and this sort of heaviness of ignoring things over here and over here. And yet now we are in this place of sort of active, inflamed trauma in every being and Earth
Right.
through COVID, just exploding. So my belief now is like the big task of humanity is inside and is to connect with one another as we go inside, and regaining the tools of connection, of love, of freedom. So we don't need to put the overlay on of, an entire society who's sick, who's dysfunctional, who's medicated, and we say this is a soul sickness that we are the medicine of. And so finding ways for me to express this professionally is sort of what I'm doing now. And it's been a joy. It's been a joy and a total mystery. It's totally living in the mystery because, I kind of go into one pocket and I realize, ooh, there's something really beautiful over here. And so I'm continuing as a practitioner, working really with love as the ultimate healing energy that we all hold as the essential part of our being, and sharing that in ways that are accessible for other people to receive and experience with a minimal amount of belief structure necessary. So I work with devout religious people, I work with atheists. So how can I help others find this healing power that is love, without dogma and without the many overlays of the therapeutic conventions that make some people well and other people sick. And so it's an interesting place to be. That's definitely in the primordial soup somewhere of my journey.
We share that. I too,
For sure.
having come from 35 years at a fairly religious background, teaching Sunday school for 15 of those years, having left that all behind 30 years ago, it's been a task of shedding dogma, shedding, and releasing anything that somebody has to believe beyond the description of we were all born innocent, life happened, and we, as you say, got these layers and layers and layers and layers of fear and armor, and once we release all of that through lots of good work, what's left is our innocence now wise, is our innocence now brought forward into this moment of collective wisdom where there's no one to blame. There's no one to shame for how we are right now. There's just the awareness that we were unconscious coming into awareness, one by one, now collectively coming into awareness. And it still comes down to person connection points. I wonder at some point, is there a flash point? Is there a quickening? Is there a moment where we've reached a tipping point and we truly have crossed the Rubicon of love And I think we're past it now. As crazy and hard as things feel and seem right now, I think it's all because, like you say, we kept it under wraps for so long. We kept the rage and the anger and the frustration with this experience, this human experience, at bay. And now our nervous systems are so fried, so overwhelmed, that we are so dysregulated that the scream is universal, that we're just going to reach a point where the scream is louder than the reasons we come up with not to express it.
And I want to really honor you for what you've said on the previous episodes of this podcast, which is, that is, to me, right there, you are right in line with, when that scream begins to vibrate through us, it is madness. And if we are not conscious, oh, I'm conscious. Like, that is such a turn off for me to even use that word often. But it's if we are not aware that this is part of the human experience and it's erupting inside of us, and we do not have a teacher, we do not have a community, or we do not have, we are in a violent or abusive or harmful situation, that great scream can, I believe, be part of like the shattering of our selves, into the kind of despair and even deeper disconnection. And yet it's that very same process that, if done and honored,
Ritualized,
and made space
honored
for in the collective, ritualized, honored, and that we say that there. And so I have had a primal scream in such a place in Toronto by a beautiful young woman leading this kind of emotional expression work, as it grew out of the International School of Temple Arts, ISTA, an organization really dedicated to a lot of deep work in releasing shame and opening into kind of a deeper experience of who we are. And so there's a set of practices that they teach that she just put in a giant warehouse, and a second-story warehouse in kind of an industrial part of downtown Toronto, turned up some loud, heavy metal music, and really in a ritualized space, created this space in which I can remember like this scream beginning to move through me, thinking, okay, now this is humanity's scream. My little brain saying, who are you to scream humanity scream? And then thinking, well, okay, here it is. It's coming anyway. Here it is. It's coming anyway. And then the ecstasy of it. I mean, total ecstasy of the scream, becoming the wholeness of the suffering and deep release. And I can remember afterwards someone coming up to me and saying, thank you for doing this work. I'm like, oh, I don't know. Like, to me, I was just really screaming my head off. Obviously, like some sort of big experience on the outside. So it was, I bring that up because, that was, who knows what people are doing. On that day in that Canadian city, people were invited into this experience of touching that place that is moving, not even that wants to move, but it's moving, and it's moving through us. And when we consciously invite ourselves into the dance, when we allow ourselves to be worthy of embodying this, because we're here, it's happening. And so many people, we're trying to keep the lid on, and the suffering and the pressure of this, creating ideas that I'm broken, when, you are this magnificent being blowing open with the geyser force of the universe, dear human being, and
it's so after many rounds of Primal Scream on 5-MeO, I thought I was done with the scream, and I went into an assisted session with a practitioner and a medical doctor, all the things, to have a ketamine journey with a group of other people. And I didn't think I would be screaming. It didn't feel like that was what wanted to come. But as the medicine came on, it was a very eruptive expression. I mean, it just came. And at one moment, the ego, like you, kind of jumps in and says, wait a minute, you can't do this. This is going to be too disruptive to everybody else in the room. And then you just let go and you let it happen. You trust that your expression is exactly, if it's authentic and true to you, it will resonate and find its place in the zeitgeist of healing for everybody else. And at towards the final stages of that journey, I heard another woman screaming across the room, and her scream met mine, and all of a sudden, it was like my scream and her scream, we witnessed each other, and it morphed into a song. It morphed into a sound that was much more sort of a primordial expression. A song is a beautiful, I'm not saying it was in tune. I'm not saying it was pleasant to the ear, but it was harmonious between the two of us. And I had this real sense that beyond the scream is a harmony of souls. There's a harmonic convergence that's calling us all forward, and that the scream, the anger, the frustration, the anxiety, the dread, the existential dread that we're all feeling right now because of the state of our planet, the state of humanity, it is a rite of passage to the birthing of a new story. And so it's fitting that we have a journalist here and a grandmother, and you know, we're here to birth a new story. As I came out of that journey, a sister was sitting next to me taking notes of whatever the first language came forward out of me, and I said, I feel as though I've just given birth to myself and all of humanity. And she leaned in and she said she had just gotten back from Peru, and that the elders, the mountain elders, had just said that the new story would be birthed from the womb of the crone. And I feel like this conversation, maybe you're my first guest on the Primal Scream podcast, that maybe we're birthing something from the womb of our croneness. So thank you for being with me today to share in this exploration. Don't have answers. Very curious to know how that scream is showing up for others, and what is the message that wants to come forward in all of us. So thank you, Michelle. Thanks for being with us today. I have a sense you and I could go on for days, and I'm sure we will, to be continued. But for the container of this episode, I really appreciate you. Do you have any final thoughts or shares?
I'd just like to add that there comes a point where the responsibility is also there for us to step up. That it's not just the opportunity, that it becomes the responsibility. And how do we do that in a way that feels still within our free will, still of honor?
Yeah. There is that we-ness part of this that we have to navigate. And I always think of it in these terms: when we know better, we do better. Thank you, Maya Angelou. And that all of consciousness is staying present to the gap and inching closer and closer to closing that gap between knowing better and doing better. Maybe so. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the Primal Scream podcast. We appreciate your willingness to sit in the pain and exploration of a fellow human. It is our hope that you found a thread that you can weave into your own story going forward. There is great beauty on the other side of the primal scream. A wise elder once said, "We are the ones we've been waiting for." And we are not waiting any longer for someone or something to shift the human story from fear to love. It's on us to redeem ourselves from our individual and collective unconsciousness, to find our ease of beingness. The future belongs to those who show up. We'll leave you with the song Like the Children Do by Meredith McHenry. She reminds us that the way home is the path of innocence reclaimed. See you on the next podcast. Have a beautiful day.
Put down your armor, I'll put mine down too. We'll do like the children know how to do. We'll fill up a pail with the pain they caused you. We'll pour it all out like the children do. Don't get me wrong, you can't walk over me. But I'm strong enough to hold you when you're weak. I know I fucked up and you sure have too. So let's just start over like children do. Can we just go back to the time before our innocence was stolen? I don't know how to get us there, but I'll keep hoping. I'll keep hoping to do like the children do. We can do like the children do. I'll open my bleeding heart to you. Let's just pretend for a minute or two that our hearts can bend without shattering through. We'll find that forgiveness as if we're brand new. And you'll walk through the fire like it can't burn you. Can we just go back to the time before our innocence was stolen? I don't know how to get us there, but I'll keep trying. I'll keep trying to do like the children do. We can do like the children do. I'll open my filthy hands to you. Can't we do like the children do? Can't we do like the children do? 'Cause I don't want to say goodbye to you. Put down your armor, I'll put